It is my pleasure to introduce Steve Mcmullen. He is an associate professor of economics at Hope College. He is the executive editor of the journal Faith and Economics and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. He received his PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina and his undergraduate degree from Bethel University. He is the author or co-author of two books, Animals in the Economy and Digital Life Together, The Challenge of Technology for Christian Schools. And without further ado, here's Steve.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And thank you all for coming to listen to me talk about the environment here this morning. It's fun to see friends in the audience here, although sometimes all I can see is your name, but that's perfectly fine. After teaching during COVID here for a while, I'm sort of used to interacting this way. It's not terrible. It's not the best, but we'll do it. It's also just a real pleasure always to do things with HASP. This is maybe the second or third presentation I've done over the last 6 years or so, and I'm looking forward to it. Let me just say from the outset that we have a really big topic. So I'm going to talk about the economics of sustainability. And so there's a lot of things that I'd like to talk about in this topic that I won't be able to. But I am going to try to hit a few really big ideas that hopefully will spur your thinking and spur some conversation. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation here, and that will give you something visual to stare at other than my face. Let's see if I can get it working. Okay. Okay. So my goal for today really is to give you an intuition behind some of the biggest ideas in environmental economics, but then also to give you a bit of my own reservations about some of those big ideas. And in doing so, you're going to get, we're going to be able to walk through like two big areas of policy or two big areas of environmental stewardship that are really important, I think, right now. And we'll be able to focus in on those a little bit, and that'll be climate change and also endangered species. What I won't be able to do today in my presentation is spend a lot of time talking, with any kind of real care about how we should think theologically about the environment and the economy. But I'm really happy to dig into some of that kind of stuff in questions as it comes up. Let me give you a quick overview. So I think some of the big themes that I'd like to walk you through today is to note, first of all, that when we're talking about environmental problems, and I think environmental problems are some of the biggest and most important ones for us to be thinking about together today. Obviously the coronavirus has taken the top slot in our attention for quite some time, and rightly so. But in terms of public policy and political questions and what we need to cooperate to get done as a society, some of the biggest ones are environmental problems, particularly if we want to think long term. So when we turn our attention to the big environmental problems, I think there's two big things going on. The first is a disagreement about what is valuable and how we know what is valuable and how we value it. And I'll talk about that kind of over and over again as we walk through this presentation today. And the second is that sometimes, even if we know what is valuable, trying to get the right kind of cooperation so that we can solve the problem is very difficult. So thinking about what is valuable and also how we achieve a kind of wide cooperation to solve a particular problem. These are the big themes when we start thinking about the environment and the economy. So we're going to hit both of those themes as we talk about carbon emissions and endangered species and climate change. And I'm going to give you the economist spin on all of this, because economists have a kind of unique way of thinking about environmental problems. I think it's a really valuable way, and hopefully you'll agree with me by the time we're done that economists have something really important to contribute here. And the economic way of thinking about this sort of zeroes in on the kind of trade-offs we face and thinks about the way in which we can resolve those trade-offs in a kind of transparent way by thinking about prices and market mechanisms and public policy. Let me start though with kind of the big question. And I think this is the big question because I think a lot of the disagreements we have about the environment come down to disagreements about what is valuable. And so let me just go back to one of the first environmental crises or debates or big public policy arguments from when I was young, and it's one of the first ones I remember. I mean, I guess I can't tell you which came first, the spotted owl or the ozone deplete, the hole in the ozone layer, but both of these were happening when I was young. So let's think about the spotted owl though. So the conflict, and many of you will probably remember this, but in the Pacific Northwest, there was a big conflict between folks who
Stephen, you're muted.
Unmute. Okay, I have no idea why I'm muted, but whatever. Let's go back
now.
All right. All right. So, so the spotted owl thing, there was a conflict between folks who were engaged in the lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest, particularly, and environmentalists who realized that these old forests were one of the only remaining habitats for this species of owl that you see prominently displayed on the screen. It's a spotted owl. It's one of the rarer owls in North America. And so this created a big fight, and it was a fight between the usual suspects. It was, industry organizations versus the Sierra Club. Which do we value more, the jobs and the economy and people's lives, or this owl that nobody knew about before it showed up in the news? And you probably remember the argument. And this was, I think, a stand-in for a much bigger debate that we were having at the time and still have today, right? How do we weigh this conflict between endangered species on the one hand, say, and then economic activity on the other? I mean, there are people whose livelihoods are at stake when we decide to stop logging in the Pacific Northwest. There are people whose livelihoods are at stake when we declare a particular area a habitat for an endangered species, if that means they can't use it for ranching or farming. Right, and so we face real trade-offs between good things. But we can push this further, right? We face a similar kind of trade-off when we start thinking about climate change, right? There's this trade-off between cheap transportation, which means affordable goods and services. If people are living near the poverty line, having low-price food is just really important. But at the same time, that transportation network creates a lot of climate emissions, which contributes to climate change. And so we have the immediate problem of people's standard of living pitted against this long-term climate and environmental problem. And we could also think of that in terms of a big conflict, between whether we want, how we think about the trade-off between prosperity today and then prosperity down the road, well into the future, with lots of uncertainty. We know that some of these environmental problems, like climate change, could have a really long, slow impact. But the impacts of our actions today in terms of climate and emissions could have sort of their full impact only 50 or 100 years down the road. And so we face these really difficult trade-offs and really difficult dilemmas, and reasonable people can disagree about which is more important when we start realizing that we have a dilemma in which we have to choose between multiple really valuable things. Now, I point all of that out because I think at its heart, when we start talking about environmental problems, usually the disagreements are right here. Usually the disagreements are about what is more important in the end. It's not about how we should respond to things. I mean, we argue about climate change and about how serious it will be, or how much uncertainty there is, or who's lying to us when we deal with these big environmental problems. Is it the oil companies or is it the environmentalists? But once we wade through that, and once we get a handle on a similar set of observations about the world, we still often have a disagreement. And the disagreement is about how much we should value some parts of our environment versus how much we should value perhaps some parts of the economy. All right, so that means that we're going to face big trade-offs. So this is where economists enter with a kind of a unique perspective. So when economists think about environmental problems, we usually try to put explicit values on things so that we can compare. So in particular, economists think that we're always better able to manage trade-offs and to talk precisely about those trade-offs if we can wrap our head around in a real tangible way what we're trading off. And we do that by trying to put prices on things. Now, sometimes it's a little bit weird and awkward to do so, but it kind of helps. For example, if you were trying to decide whether or not to spend some money now or save it and give it to your children or your grandchildren, you have a kind of a trade-off. One of the ways in which you can think about that trade-off between now and the future, or even if just saving money, spending money now or saving it for retirement or something of the sort, one of the ways to think about that is to note the value of the things you could do with your money now, and then think about how much interest you'd earn if you put it in the bank or in a retirement account or something of the sort, how much more valuable it would be sometime down the road. Which is to say that you could do kind of an explicit monetary comparison of the value of the money now compared to the value of the money plus interest 10 years or 20 years later. Thinking through the numbers on that helps, right? It gets us further. It's a little harder, but we can do the same kind of thing when we start thinking about environmental things. For instance, when we're trying to put the value on building a new park, economists will often go around and try to figure out how much that park would be worth to people, whether it's a national park or maybe a local amenity. Economists will ask people, how much would you be willing to pay in tax dollars to have a nice park in the middle of town? And they'll sometimes run experiments to try to figure out how much people are willing to pay to get access to some of these things. And then they can add up the amount that people are willing to pay. They can compare that to the cost of building the park. And you can get some sense of whether or not the park, even though it might be paid for with public money, whether or not it's the sort of thing that people will value enough to make it worth buying. Now, we have to push this even further when we start thinking about things like endangered species and climate change. Frankly, it's just really hard to put a price on something like a spotted owl. But often what we find is that if we create mechanisms that sort of act like markets, we can or provide property rights that allow people to make sort of careful individuals, sort of business-like decisions about parts of the natural environment, that it kind of gets us part of the way there. That is, it helps people put prices on things like endangered species and the climate. So I want you to think about it this way as I start thinking about as I start walking through different policy options. It turns out that economists usually try to propose solutions to environmental problems that involve naturally putting prices on things that will build in the real value of the environmental harm. Now that sounds really abstract now. If you have questions, feel free to send them in, and I can pause and answer them periodically. I should ask right now, has anyone been asking questions, particularly clarification questions that I should jump into right now? I don't think I see any, but I'm not sure I have access to the chat. No, I don't see any coming in yet. Okay. So with that kind of abstract overview, let's talk about specifics. So I said we were going to talk about two big environmental issues, and one is going to be climate change and the other is endangered species. So let me explain how both of these can be thought of as a kind of coordination problem. And then I'm going to explain how solutions to both of these problems are often proposed in a way that involve putting prices on things to sort of capture the real value. So first, the coordination. So it turns out that often environmental problems involve people acting individually in a way that they wouldn't act if we all got together and agreed on what we should do. So let's think climate change here. I have a picture here, of course, some of you will recognize this, of course. This is the retired James D. Young power plant, which is right down the road. Or has this thing hasn't been torn down yet, I don't think. I think this is still here, I have to go check. But this is a retired coal power plant, and there's similar plants all over the country, right? And one of the things we've learned is that coal fired power plants are some of the substantial contributors to greenhouse gases. So that every one of these plants and other kinds of power do the same thing, but coal in particular emits a whole lot of CO2 into the atmosphere that acts as a greenhouse gas, and over long periods of time, right, that contributes to global warming. And the same thing is true with our cars. The same thing is true with methane emissions. It's also a very powerful greenhouse gas. And so let's think about how the problem of greenhouse gases is kind of a coordination problem. Notice that if we just think about Holland and how we're going to get electricity, building a coal-fired power plant makes sense. So coal is very cheap. It's very easy to turn coal into electricity. It burns very well. And so that can easily generate heat without really sophisticated technology. We can use that heat to generate electricity, and we can easily power all of the electric grid in the local area. Now, of course, we're putting stuff into the air that we don't like. It's not just CO2, but CO2 is sort of the pollutant of the day as we're thinking about climate change. And so we're throwing carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, and that hurts us a little bit. But notice that it only hurts us a very small amount. The effects of the CO2 that we locally put into the air are spread all over the globe. So the benefits of the power plant are local, but the cost in terms of pollution is global. So this is why it's a coordination problem, is that the costs are being borne by folks all over the planet, and they're really, really small. So small that if we only had this one coal power plant, it just wouldn't be an issue. The problem, of course, is that there's coal power plants all over the world. And there's other kinds of fossil fuel burning all over the world. And when everyone individually is doing this, it turns out that all of this CO2 together from power plants all over the globe and from cars all over the globe, and also things like lawnmowers and cook fires and other kinds of things, they emit enough stuff in the atmosphere that global warming is a real problem. So individually, we're not making a weird choice at all. We're not imposing ridiculous costs. But when everyone behaves the same way, then we have a big problem. But it's a problem that we can only wrap our heads around if we think globally. Okay, so it's a coordination problem. We all got to get together if we want to think about how to solve global warming, because the behavior of people all over the world matters. Second example, one of my favorite sort of environmental stories is the tragedy of the passenger pigeon. So it wasn't very long ago that passenger pigeons were numerous enough in North America that their flocks, as you probably will have heard very famously, would darken the sky as they flew by. And that was true in this area. It was in the 1800s. In particular, they were hunted very aggressively, in part because they were so numerous. You could aim, or actually you wouldn't even have to aim very much, but you could aim a gun at a flock of passenger pigeons, and with the right kind of ammunition, you could hit lots of birds very easily, and people ate them. And so for this, among other reasons, the passenger pigeons were hunted. And so they went from between the 1850s and the early 1900s from being so numerous that people could not imagine ever running out of passenger pigeons to being entirely extinct. And so this is one of a couple of big tragedies from this era in terms of our inability in the late 1800s to see what was coming in terms of our hunting practices. And we'll talk about some others in a little bit. But the passenger pigeon in particular, the populations declined so dramatically and so quickly that it became a kind of morality tale, particularly for folks interested in birds. Now, how is this a coordination problem? Much like the climate, passenger pigeons were so numerous that no one person hunting passenger pigeons was going to do even a small damage to the overall population. It's only when people all over the country are hunting passenger pigeons in really large numbers that the flocks start to decline precipitously. And it just turns out passenger pigeons, and we didn't know this, but they were evolved to survive in large flocks and in large groups. And other pigeons don't behave this way, but it was such that once the population got sufficiently small, it just collapsed, and that their large flocks were protective. So we have individual action, which makes sense, but when everybody's doing the same thing, we run into a big problem. So it's a coordination problem. If we all got together and agreed to shoot passenger pigeons a little bit less, we would still have them around. All right, so we could talk about lots of others, but I think those give you the sense of how we face coordination problems, and that actually most environmental problems can be thought in this way, can be thought of as a kind of coordination problem. And I think this is enough for us to start thinking about solutions, because this is where I want to spend some time, is to try to explain how putting the proper value on things sometimes is enough to change individual behavior to bring about some kind of coordination. So let's flip back to climate change. So how do we assign a price to greenhouse gases or to the climate? And how would that work to solve, or to at least contribute to, a solution to climate change? The two major policies that are tossed around these days for dealing with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions are cap and trade policies and carbon taxes. Now, both of these are really interesting because they have kind of the same effect in terms of assigning a price to emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And the way I'll talk about cap and trade policies really briefly. I think carbon taxes are a little bit more elegant, and so I'll spend some more time there. The way a cap and trade policy works, and some of you know these details, I'm sure, because we've had these kinds of policies in place for some other air pollutants for quite some time, including sulfur dioxide. But a cap and trade policy does this. It first of all sets a limit. It says over a period of a year for the entire country, we only want a certain amount of metric tons of carbon to be emitted in the atmosphere in the United States, or sulfur dioxide, or some other pollutant. And then once they hit that limit, then they break up that limit into little chunks. And they say, all right, we're going to break up, if we say we wanted 100 metric tons, that's wildly low, but let's say 100 metric tons. And then we break those up, and so that we have we break it up into little permissions or contracts or vouchers or something of the sort that give you permission to emit 1 ton of carbon into the atmosphere, say. And then the government distributes these permission slips all over the economy to power plants and to automobile manufacturers or whoever needs them. In some systems, they auction off these initial permits to pollute. In some cases, they give them away to the folks that have already built up an industry and that really need them. It all kind of depends on who has political power at the moment. But the point is that once these vouchers or permission slips are out there, then people can sell them. So if your company has a permit to pollute and you find a way to pollute less, you can sell that permit to someone else. And that makes the right to pollute a valuable thing, which is to say that it puts a price on it in the market, because then the price that people have to pay to buy one of these permits from someone who already has one, that naturally reveals to us kind of how much people are willing to pay to put pollutants in the atmosphere. That's useful to us. It tells us how much it costs, for instance, to limit pollution. But it also helps businesses build in the cost of the pollution into their business model. if that's a little confusing, I think the carbon tax is even is works similarly, but it's more straightforward. And that is, in the carbon tax policy, the government just assigns a tax for every unit of pollution that you put into the atmosphere. So ideally, we'd impose a carbon tax that's really broad, that attacked all kinds of pollution that were similar from lots of different sources. But the idea is every time a ton of carbon was put in the atmosphere, the company that did the pollution might have to pay $10 or $20 or $50 or something. And if we assign that to power plants and to automobiles and we build it into the price of lawnmowers and we put it all over the entire economy, then what we're doing is we're building the cost of the pollution right into the purchase decision, which is to say that we're able to ask people to consider the broad effects of the pollution when they put gas in their gas tank, or when they turn on the electricity because it's going to be built into their electricity bill, or when a power plant is deciding what kind of plant we're going to build. Are we going to build another coal plant or a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant? The cost and the value to the companies of these different choices is going to reflect also not just the cost and the benefits of the different kinds of power, but it's also going to reflect the cost of the pollution. So this is a way of taking a social problem, the pollution, right, which is big and it covers the whole globe. And it's a way of taking the costs of the whole population and sort of divvying them out into the individual decisions that are contributing to it. All right. Now, this has a couple of advantages. The first big advantage is that it helps us find the cheapest way to reduce emissions. So if you are a power company and you have a number of different power plants in your portfolio, say, you'll know which of those power plants are more and less efficient. Now, if the government comes in and just says we need to shut down all of the coal-fired power plants or something of the sort, or we need to or just imposes a rule, you might end up sort of sloppily doing something that's kind of inefficient. But if you put a price on the pollution, the company can look across their own power plants and they can say, okay, we need to reduce emissions. The most efficient way for our company to do that is to shut down this power plant, or to only run this power plant when we need extra capacity, and to push more power out of these other ones, because it's going to be cheaper for us to make these other plants more efficient in terms of pollution than it is this one. So it pushes the question of how do we achieve reduced pollution down to the level of the company that has the best information. Now this actually works across the whole economy as well. Once we put the price on here, individuals can make decisions. Folks who are able to bike to work are encouraged to do so because the price of gas goes a little higher. But folks who could never bike to work are going to be driving the car because it's more efficient. Because with the price of the pollution kind of built in, it changes everybody's incentives. The flip side of that also is that it makes it more affordable to research and invest in alternatives. So if we have a long-term commitment to a $50 per metric ton carbon tax, for instance, then a company who's interested in doing a big investment in solar or wind power, or build a hydroelectric plant, or some other kind of investment in renewable energy, they'll know that we have sort of built into policy a kind of price advantage for these renewable energies because they won't be emitting carbon. And that creates incentive for power companies to shift their efforts even more than they already do toward renewable energies, and to find new ways to make those renewable energies more efficient. So the carbon tax is a way for the government to encourage lower emissions, even if they don't know how we should do that, right? The government doesn't have to know what kind of power plants. Government doesn't have to know whether or not wind or solar power is going to be the better deal in 10 years. They don't have to know which people should be commuting by bike versus car. They don't need to know any of this. If they put the price in place, then individual folks can find the best strategies for reducing their own emissions. Okay, let me pause there again and see if there's any questions.
Yep, Steve, I have a couple.
All right, good.
First one is from Ben. Have we made significant enough progress on the public perception of the validity of climate change in order to move forward? Or do you believe it will require a COVID-like crisis to affect real progress?
That's a great question. You may notice that my presentation did not include 2 or 3 slides explaining that climate change was a real problem and what it was going to do. My sense is at this point, there are certainly folks that have real questions about climate science. And there are folks who think that the solutions like a carbon tax are overly aggressive. But my sense is that there is enough of a consensus now. There we go. All right. I think there is enough of a consensus now that climate change is a problem and it's something that we need to do something about. That the debate has now shifted to how serious is the problem. At least in terms of the kind of consensus conversations that I'm a part of. Even between liberals and conservatives in Washington today, the question seems to be, what does good policy look like? And there's still big disagreements, right? Folks on the left want to do something big and dramatic, and folks on the right want to be a lot more cautious about these kinds of policies. But there is some consensus. I think that's a big deal. Now to
jump in with just a quick piece of data on that, Steve.
Yeah.
The Holland Climate Collaborative recently cooperated with WEMEAC to do a survey of voters in Muskegon and Ottawa County, contacted by phone 2,500 voters and asked some very simple questions that added up to, do you believe climate change is real in your life and would you like your local government to do something? 75% were supportive.
Now that is actually a little surprising.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I wouldn't have guessed the number was that high, if only because I think, particularly in a place like West Michigan, it's harder to see, and I think if you're in the Southwest and you're a rancher, I think it's easier to see the effects of climate change. But in West Michigan, I don't think we see it. And of course, this is a fairly conservative area.
We thought so too, and so we broke the data down by political jurisdiction. The numbers still, Grand Haven would be more like 85% and Georgetown Township would be more like 65%, but there were none below 60% in support.
And I think in my memory, so I've been paying close attention to this for maybe a decade, and I think that has been that decade we've seen a lot of movement, particularly among young people. I mean, I don't see my college students that I'm teaching in particular. I think there's been a big change. College students in 2010, there would have been a lot of really serious debate about whether or not climate change was caused by human action, and I don't see that kind of debate happening today.
Okay, thank you. The last question in the chat right now is, what are the issues, if any, with the New Holland power plant?
Oh, well, so I don't know the details. My understanding is the new power plant we have is a natural gas power plant, and natural gas is better for the environment than coal. A lot of people are talking about natural gas as kind of a transition fuel, in that it's a fossil fuel. It's not renewable. The extraction of natural gas has real environmental problems, but it's better than coal in a couple of different dimensions, and it's affordable right now. And so, every year solar power and wind power and power, I want to say hydroelectric, but there's power generators using waves and rivers and other kinds of things that are really neat and creative these days. There's so many advances that a decade from now in particular, I think we can be really confident that solar power is just going to be really, really cheap. We have to get through that decade, We could make big solar power investments now, but it's going to be a lot cheaper in a few years. And so I think the way to think about a natural gas power plant is biding time. And then the question is, how much time do we have? I'd be one that would push for really aggressive investments in renewable energy, but other folks are obviously interested in something a little bit more cautious. But that's as much as I can tell you.
Another aspect of the cap and trade option is it enables groups like the Sierra Club to buy these permission slips for the purpose of not using them.
Yes, that's true. You can put a part of putting an explicit price on these emissions is that anybody can buy them. And if there's a lot of demand for people to reduce emissions, you can buy up those rights, which raises the price for everybody else, and also just reduces the total amount of emissions out there. And I've heard of efforts to do that, and my sense is it hasn't had a huge impact in those places where they've done it, just because the Sierra Club is just not that rich. But there have been there's been similar efforts, of course, with land. It's people buying up land to turn them into preserves and parks, which is a kind of analogous thing as well. Okay, so we can talk more about carbon taxes. I could talk about carbon taxes a long time. I think there's some really interesting, neat policy sort of questions here. But let me turn and note that I want to emphasize that there's no silver bullet here, and that these policies have some real advantages. I think we should impose a carbon tax, but there's still really big dilemmas. So, for instance, there's big disagreements about how big the tax should be, and you can think about the obvious disagreements between conservatives who want to move a lot slower, be more protective of the economy, and folks on the left who want to be more aggressive in protecting the environment. There's going to be a debate there. But there's also just a lot of disagreement about how much damage the emissions for the climate are doing, and over what time frame. And there's some uncertainty legitimately over what the next 50 or 100 years look like. We learn every year more about climate change impacts, and that makes it really difficult to know what price to put on emissions today. And so when you talk to scholars who are estimating what is the cost today of adding more emissions to the climate, and what kind of cost should we build into the price of coal or natural gas or something of the sort, or gasoline, there's just wild disagreement, from $10 a metric ton to $100 a metric ton, which would have dramatically different impacts in the economy. But the even thornier questions are pragmatic ones about whether or not we can coordinate something like a carbon tax with countries all over the world, because the US is a big player when it comes to carbon emissions, but we're not the biggest, not in a per person or in aggregate. China emits a lot more than we do, although a lot less per person. And there's actually quite a few countries that are emitting, there's a handful of countries that are emitting more carbon per person than the US. And this just isn't one of those things where we could solve the problem by acting alone. Now, you can make a case that the US could impose a carbon tax and the rest of the world could ignore it and do nothing, and it might still be worth doing. Like, the benefits to humanity overall might be big enough that it would be worth it for the US to emit less. But in terms of actually slowing down climate change, we really just have to come to an international agreement, right? And of course, we know these have been tried, going all the way back to the Kyoto Protocol, and then most recent, the Paris Climate Accord. But these agreements are difficult to hold. They agree, when countries agree to climate change action, they often agree and then follow it in so much as their local economies allow them to. It's just really, really difficult to coordinate worldwide. And then there's even a thornier ethical question about whether or not the United States and China both should reduce emissions the same amount, when historically the US has emitted lots more carbon into the atmosphere than China has. There's a very real sense in which the folks around the world who are already rich we as countries, at least not individually perhaps, but as countries, we have histories of carbon emissions that are much higher than the poorer countries around the world. And so imposing a strict carbon tax across the globe has a kind of injustice to it as well. So that coordination has all kinds of questions of fairness built into it as well. Well, anyway, so there's big questions of value. How do we know what the value of pollution versus abatement is, but also how would we distribute those costs? We can talk about some of those things if you want later. And I really need to move on to my second big topic though, and hopefully you'll see some parallels. So the area that I know more about actually than carbon emissions and climate change is endangered species. I've done much more study of animal ethics, animal agriculture, and endangered species policy than other topics in environmental economics that I often talk about. And I get passionate about thinking about endangered species in part because there's a kind of irreversibility to species extinctions that's really tragic, and it also has just real long-term effects potentially, and the scale of the problem shouldn't be mitigated. So I don't have numbers here for you, in part because we don't have good numbers. But the best estimates of how many species are going extinct per year are that we're losing species at something like 10 times to 1,000 times the rate at which species naturally go extinct. Now you'll note that the range between 10 and 1,000 is huge. So how can we not know how many species are going extinct? What the difference between the 10 and the 1,000 is dramatic. But the problem is, of course, is that species that are really rare are also, because they're really rare, really hard to track. And often they're species we don't know much about. And so we honestly don't have great numbers for the rate at which species in exotic locales are going extinct when we just don't even understand the ecosystems really well. And so the best we can do is estimate. And it looks like species are going extinct wildly faster than they would naturally, particularly over the last couple hundred years. But it's not just species extinctions that I worry about. It's also just the dramatic reductions in the number of wild animals and insects and fish that live in the world today. We have, if you just think of all of the animals in the world by mass, like the way a physicist would perhaps, just what's the total mass of animal life? And then you take out animal agriculture, right? The chickens and the cows and the pigs and whatnot. We have just a small fraction of the fish in the ocean and the wild animals and birds and insects that we had even 100 years ago. So even if these species, even for species that aren't endangered, in that we're not worried about them going extinct, we just see dramatically fewer birds and insects and I mean everything but squirrels, I think, and coyotes seem to be doing okay, but just very, very dramatic. So I was supposed to explain the problem. So how is this a coordination problem? Well, the most common way that economists talk about endangered species is to think of it as a tragedy of the commons, which is a really common way of thinking about these. And so you may very well be familiar with it. But the tragedy of the commons is a sort of analogy, and it comes from England in the period in the 1700s, in which you would have a commons area in a town in which everyone could graze their animals. And if you go and you travel to England right now, around some towns, you can still find big fields near the town that were the town commons, and in which people would graze their animals. Now, the tragedy of the commons is that everybody has an incentive to put one more animal into the commons so that they get the advantage of the grazing. But if everybody puts too many animals into the same field, of course, it gets overgrazed and it can't support any of the animals. And so there needs to be some balance. Like everyone needs to contribute only a small number of animals to the common field in order for the field to be able to support all of the animals. And this has become the way economists talk about lots of common resources, including most obviously fish in the ocean or in other fisheries, where we can only pull so many fish out of the ocean from a given population and reasonably expect that fish population to regenerate. And we now have just so many examples of overfishing that we can talk about lots and lots of cases in which we didn't coordinate our behavior. Everybody races to get as many fish as they can, and then the fish populations collapse. And this is a tragedy of the commons problem. It's a coordination problem. So how do we solve this problem? Well, there's a couple of different ways. Of course, we can talk about the Endangered Species Act and rules about fishing. The way that economists will often talk, particularly folks in the free market environmentalist school of thought, is to think in terms of property rights. And there's some really good reasons why we would think this way. So let me tell you the story of two different animals and how assigning kind of careful property rights and creating a kind of market for harvesting these animals can be really important. So first, I think this is a king crab, if I remember my species correctly. So crab fishermen this was one example where fishermen were engaging in a kind of a really aggressive, actually fairly dangerous race to kind of find the crabs in the ocean in order to collect them because they're prized for food. And then what happened was, so we had lots and lots of fishing companies going out and trying to find the crabs and harvesting them very aggressively until we instituted a property regime in which individual fishing companies had the right to harvest a certain number of these crabs over a period of year in a wide area. And if this sounds like the pollution permits, there's a reason. It's a very, very similar kind of idea. So we give particular fishing companies the right, and then we set a cap at the number that can be harvested. Incidentally, we had the cap before, but then everybody would just race to harvest the crabs right up until the cap. Once you assign the rights to harvest for a particular area for a particular year to a company, all of a sudden the nature of the industry changes. So the people engaged in the harvesting and in the fishing don't have to race. They can be much more careful. They can be sure to pull some fish and leave others there. So they want to maintain a breeding population. They don't have the incentive to grab the younger fish, for instance, because they know that they'll grow and that they'll have the ability to harvest them later. And so having ownership over a particular area and a particular part of a harvest creates the incentive for fishing companies to behave like you would with a fish farm or with a local agricultural system where you own the land, because all of a sudden the long run profitability of that fishery is in the interest of that particular company. And assigning fishing rights for king crabs in particular were really dramatically changed the nature of the industry, and the crab population started to recover, and the fishing industry became less dangerous, and there were other environmental benefits for the ecosystem, actually. Another great example of this is the North American bison. So these, of course, are beautiful, intimidating, iconic animals native to North America. There were, at one point in the 17 and early 1800s, just millions and millions of these animals in the Great Plains. And then in the mid to late 1800s, there was a campaign to hunt the bison for a couple of different reasons. They were their skins were valuable, but also it was an effort to clear the land for cattle ranching and to limit the ability of Native American populations to benefit from the buffalo herds. All this happened around the 1880s, and over a very short period of time, the buffalo herds were just wiped out. So at the very last minute, the government realized that, wait a second, maybe we don't want zero buffalo. And they tried to grab some of the buffalo and create a herd. But they weren't the only ones. There were some private folks who also collected some wild buffalo and kept them on their land. And And it turns out the government efforts just failed, but the buffalo are alive today because the private efforts to continue to breed the buffalo were promising and flourished, and then they owned these animals and they had an incentive to breed the populations. And then now, of course, buffalo are valuable and you can eat their meat, and there's big enough herds, some in public parks, but also run by ranchers that the population has recovered substantially. So the private ownership of the buffalo is what saved the species. Okay, so this is a story that we've told lots of different times and lots of different ways. It turns out for some of these species, when we have a commons problem, having people own the animals is a great way to save the species, because it allows people to think carefully and make long-term plans about the effectiveness of the rate at which they're harvesting the animals or killing them, and so on and so forth. Two problems with this model. So the first problem is that it only really works for animals that we want to buy. It turns out that less than half of the animals that are endangered because of overfishing or overhunting. So let's talk spotted owls again. Turns out nobody was hunting spotted owls. Nobody wanted to harvest them. Their feathers were not particularly valuable. They were just, as is the case with many endangered species, they were the victim of having their habitats destroyed. And there were some other competitive pressures in the spotted owls as well. And so creating property rights in spotted owls probably wouldn't do anything for us. Maybe property rights in the land, but still the population and the health of the spotted owls would be incidental to the value of the land for folks on the market. And so there's no easy way to create a market for spotted owl populations. And we could talk about bald eagles and peregrine falcons as well. You all may remember that in the 1970s, 1980s, when I was a child, bald eagles were very rare. And we know this is because DDT, which was used to kill insects, had the effect of making the eggs of the raptors at the top of the food chain, the eggs shells thinned, and they were not able to have baby falcons, baby eagles. This impacted some owls and hawks as well. But in particular, the peregrine falcon was almost wiped out in North America, and bald eagle populations just dramatically declined to hundreds of mating pairs instead of the 9,000 or something we have today. It turns out, again, this isn't a property rights problem. Nobody was hunting the peregrine falcon or the bald eagle. I mean, hunting the bald eagle is illegal. And yet we still had this really substantial problem. And we run into other problems, even with the kinds of animals we think might be easily owned. So with fish stocking, for instance, it turns out that ownership of fisheries is really great for preserving some fish, but not other fish. And that is, it's really great for preserving just the fish that we like to eat, but it's not great for preserving native species of fish that people don't like to harvest and eat. And with the bison, it's worth noting that the property rights were part of the problem. It turns out that assigning property to land and to animals was part of the reason the bison were wiped out in the first place. That is, cows, cattle ranches are a lot more efficient and paid a lot more at the time, and still do, than cattle, or than ranching, or than buffalo. Buffalo are harder to control. They take a lot more manpower in order to get a hide and in order to get meat. And so they probably would have been competed out and wiped out even if we had really good ownership. And it would have taken a while for us to have the population recover anyway. So the property rights regime actually can sometimes be part of the problem. Of course, the problem gets even worse when we start thinking about what characteristics we're preserving for these animals. So if you think that animals have some value in and of themselves, then we ought to note that the animals that we love the most don't always benefit from our love. So the purebred dogs are often the least healthy because we breed for characteristics that humans enjoy, not for the characteristics that lead to healthy animals. And those of you who've engaged in dog breeding know that there's a real question among dog breeders about how you maintain the health of the breed, in part because some of the pure breed dogs have just really serious chronic health problems. The same thing with chickens and turkeys that we farm. There's millions and millions of chickens and turkeys out there. I mean, in terms of populations, very healthy, right? But we've genetically manipulated chickens and turkeys to the point where they can't really live on their own anymore. They can't fly. They live very short lives, very painful lives, in part because they grow so big that their skeletons are not able to actually support the weight of the meat that we've bred them to produce in a very short period of time. So it's probably not good for the animals. And in fact, farmed animals overall don't seem to be living great lives in industrial animal agriculture, even though we have, of course, really good, really solid property rights. So what's going on here is that the property rights seem to be protecting the animals. They're only protecting the animals we value, and they're only protecting those animals often to the extent that we value them, which isn't always, we don't always value animals for their own flourishing. We tend to value them for other things instead, often for food. So there's some real limits to these solutions, but they're important solutions nevertheless. Big lessons. So environmental problems tend to be coordination problems. Right? We need to, they almost always involve some kind of coordinated activity from people in disparate locations in order to prevent the problem from getting worse or to solve it. But they also center around what we value. And that's both in that the solution to the problem means figuring out how to explicitly value these things better in prices, creating markets for things so that we can protect them, but also that even when we own something, we tend to sometimes value it for reasons that are harmful to the environment or to the animals. And I think that human ownership of animals has been great for animal populations in a lot of cases and for stewardship, but it also has a dark side in terms of the way we treat the animals that we own. And that's, I think, a fine place to end. So by my clock now, I've gone for a full hour, which is longer than anyone should have to listen to me talk. So let me see if there are some more questions.
Let's see, I have a question about whether or not you find college-age students more ready than their elders, like Haspers, to yield self-serving interest to the needs of the future instead.
I mean, yes and no. So college students often are idealistic. They're at an age in which they're willing to rethink everything, right? And at the same time, the vast majority, I don't see my college students on average, for instance, more likely to recycle than adults in Holland or senior citizens, right? I don't see huge behavioral differences in terms of like the tangible stuff that can possibly do some good. But so yes and no. In some cases, yes, dramatically, college students are interesting and fun and exciting to work with, because sometimes they adopt some of these causes and it really changes the way they think, and it can change the direction of the work they do, long term. But I don't want to overstate the social responsibility of my average student.
Right. Next question is, what are the issues with nuclear power?
That's a great question, which I should have good answers to. So my understanding is that nuclear power is, there's a lot of genuine suspicion about it, because the folks who are really suspicious about nuclear power, who really know what they're talking about, will tell me that when we talk about safe levels of radiation, that we're not sure really how safe it is, right? That there might be more problems than we think having nuclear power and dealing with the long-term nuclear waste. Generally speaking, though, nuclear power has more of a public relations problem than an environmental problem. So okay, if you made me choose energy sources and I had to redesign the grid today, I would, of course, invest heavily in wind and solar power, but I'd also probably switch really, to the extent that we can, pretty dramatically toward nuclear power, because I think the problems of nuclear power are a lot smaller than the problems for coal. But that's as much as I know. So follow-up questions will get even worse answers than that.
Okay. Well, here's a biggie. The next question is, how much time do we have to solve this problem?
-5 years.
Yeah, at least.
I mean, so here's the thing: is that the problem, particularly with climate change, is it's slow moving, slow building, serious, and the longer we wait, the more expensive the solution is. So if we had acted 10 years ago, we could have imposed a carbon tax that was relatively small, and we could have I mean, the U.S. has been decreasing our emissions. We have. It's been excellent, right? All over the place, you see more efficient cars, more efficient appliances. Where our coal power plants are putting less stuff in the atmosphere because we're doing a better job scrubbing the stuff that comes out. All this is great. It would have gone, if we'd acted more aggressively earlier, we could have had a bigger impact at a smaller cost. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it is. And if we wait to the point where everyone agrees this is a big crisis and we have to act now, that's the point at which there's not as much that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
But we often in the media we often see people saying, you know, we've got 10 more years, or we've got 5 years or something, and after that there's, you know, all is lost. And I mean, this is actually just really difficult. You can't point to a turning point. What you can point to only is just a slowly building, accelerating problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Related question. Are there opportunities or examples where proponents of the carbon tax and the zero greenhouse gases initiative advocated by Bill Gates have come together and could have more impact?
So the most interesting, I'm not sure about those specific proposals. I think the most interesting kind of consensus, bipartisan kinds of proposals out there do involve carbon taxes. But the neat ones are the ones that are trying to kind of bridge the suspicion of government activity on the right with the desire to act aggressively on the left. And I think the best proposal is the carbon tax and rebate plan that has been put out a couple of different times by groups of economists, by policymakers. I think the NASA scientist Hansen has put out a version of this as well. The idea is that you'd put a pretty strong carbon tax in place, but then you take all of the money from that and you'd give it back to people in the form of a rebate or sort of an annual check. And the idea is if you're suspicious of government activity overall, or you're worried about the carbon tax hurting the economy, which is totally legitimate, you could say, all right, we're going to make this thing revenue neutral, which is to say that this isn't an increase in taxes overall on balance. We're going to increase the price of carbon, and then we're going to give all that money back to people to spend on things. And the idea is we're shifting the incentive. We're giving everybody, because of those higher prices, we're giving everybody an incentive to change to more efficient things, but we're not making people poorer. In fact, the average the bottom 3/4 of the income distribution would probably be a little richer as a result. And that kind of policy seems to be the kind of thing that might be able to draw some pretty substantial moderate support. And then the questions are how big the tax is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most promising stuff that I've seen.
Okay. Then there's a comment from Priscilla that there was an article in the paper yesterday about the ability to sign up for an elective renewable energy rate through the BPW. And that people can speak with Julie DeCook if they want more information at the BPW, but it was hopeful.
That is an interesting idea. I had no idea about that. I'll have to look into it.
Yeah. And then a question from Laura. Do you think there are constructive takeaways from the ideas of the donut economy? Circular, outer ring, ecological limits, inner ring of essentials of life no society should be deprived of, middle sweet spot, to help us deal with the climate problem, placing less emphasis on GDP growth.
You know, I think this is interesting. And I have to say, first of all, I haven't read the book, Donut Economics, But I've been talking about it with one of my students doing an independent study, and I think we're going to crack that one open before the semester's over.
Oh, neat.
But I can briefly explain the notion, which I think is actually quite helpful as an analogy, which is to say that there's wide freedom to do economics and to craft economic policy within some limits. And the first limit is that we want to provide people with the basic ability to do the things they need to do, right? People need food, they need shelter, they need the ability to support themselves. So that's one of the rings. And then that's like the inner ring, right? We want to have an economy that's strong enough that people can do the things that they need to do. And then the outer ring is the limit, that we can't let the economy run past the kind of ecological environmental limits, right? And this is the kind of limits that I think we're running up against with species loss and with climate change. And then the goal would just be to keep the economy moving in that range. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the economy doesn't grow. It just means that the economy should grow as we discover new things and better ways to do stuff. It just means that it would grow ideally in a more sustainable direction, right? The economy can grow in a lot of different ways. And if we can grow the economy without blowing off the top of mountains in the Appalachians to get at the coal, that would be better than not.
I think that's all I have. All right, wait, hold on, a new one came in. What can we learn from GM AL moving to an all-electric model, and how did they choose that?
So the electric car sort of push is I think really interesting and hopeful. I think we learn a couple of things. One is that environmental and economic problems often they need a certain amount of momentum when we're talking about a big network. And this is true for our electric grid, and it's certainly true for our transportation network. Like, if electric cars are developed slowly and idiosyncratically around the edges, they'll never make sense, because we need a whole infrastructure for charging the cars to make the cars make sense.
Right.
And we also need to be able to manufacture them at a pretty big scale for them to be affordable, right? If you're only making a few, then they're going to be really expensive. But if you're manufacturing tens of thousands, well, then you can manufacture them in an affordable way. And we've seen electric car failures a couple of times. There's conspiracy theories about that. But I think what's happening now is we're finally getting the momentum behind electric cars, both in terms of building the infrastructure, but also in terms of the enough demand that they can be manufactured at scale. And this is helped by having new flashy companies like Tesla, of course. But then also environmental awareness is getting to the point where more and more people are willing to invest in an electric car, and the battery technology is a lot better. So I think we now have that necessary combination of things coming together so that we can see over the next 10 years a real change in our transportation networks. And I'm hopeful that if not the next car, the following car, it kind of depends on how quickly my Saturn dies, that a family like ours would be able to afford an electric car in the near future. We'll see.
Yeah. Thank you.
Steve,
Yeah.
This is Don Triesenberg. I just wanted to offer a follow-up comment about the purchase of Rex. The person before made a reference to the article in the Sentinel yesterday. And indeed, BPW does offer the opportunity for people to pay slightly more and have their electricity, quote unquote, come from green energy through the purchase of renewable energy certificates. We in the Holland Climate Collaborative have been looking at this because it gets to your issue of cooperation. If you want to do that, BPW charges you 10 cents or charges you 10% basically of your electricity bill to make it green.
Okay.
Steelcase does the same thing because it's important in their marketing to be carbon neutral, and they advertise they are. So when they go on the market to buy a Rex, they pay 2 cents a kilowatt hour, 2%. So it's just economies of scale, right? So why don't we form a co-op in town where we all pool our money so that we too can get 5 times as much savings by making a large purchase on the same scale as what Steelcase or other corporate buyers of RECs might come. So I don't know that that's a practical idea. I appreciate your reaction, but it's again that issue of cooperation in some part. Could we create a community co-op that would encourage people by making it a well-known thing, and also by offering a major reduction in the price that we would have to pay? And thirdly, at BPW, you can only buy RECs to cover your electric use. But we also drive cars and go to church and shop at the mall and all the rest. The community energy plan says when you take everything into account, each one of us is responsible for 19 metric tons of carbon per year. You can afford to buy RECs to cover all of that, especially if you purchase them through a co-op that aggregates and gets economies of scale.
You know, that's really interesting. And, you know, it raises a couple of questions, right? Where does that 10% come from, right? Why is the Board of Public Works charging that particular amount? And I just honestly just don't know how the markets work on these things. So I can't say with any confidence whether or not a co-op would be easy to set up and what kind of prices they would get. It might be that Steelcase can operate in the market just a lot more cheaply, and maybe it's a matter of scale, maybe it's something else. And it might be that 10% is actually just markup to cover to cover some other kind of associated cost for the power company. So I'm on the one hand, I think that would be a neat idea. And it'd be really cool for folks in the community to get together to figure out the issues and be able to make to pull together a co-op and then be able to present to folks in a kind of a serious way. Here's how much it's going to cost. Here's how much the costs are likely to change over time. And we can do this cheaper than the power company, if that's the case. And I just don't know, without having looked into it myself, how feasible it would be and how many people you'd need to make that doable. But if you do it, tell me about it.
We have offers, and so maybe offline we should talk. I can fill you in on some of that.
That sounds very cool.
Anyone else? Double check the chat here. I think I've covered everything. So if anyone else wants to unmute themselves to ask a question or make a comment, I think I've hopefully caught everything in the chat. If not, feel free to ask your question or comment now. Quiet out there. You've left us mesmerized, Steve.
You know, normally in my morning classes, I have a group of 25 to 30 people that I can't even tell they're alive at 8:30 in the morning, given the number of questions that I get out of them in a large group. So you guys have already way outperformed my freshmen.
Thank you. Caspers usually do, I have to say.
You were saying that economists try to put a price on everything. Can you kind of walk us through how we put a value on the spotted owl?
Yeah, you know what? It's kind of shady, frankly. But here's how you do it. I should say there's a couple of ways that we could do it. One way would be to do a kind of survey in which you just ask people, how much is this worth to you? And you could pose trade-offs, like, is it, would you be willing to pay $100 a year to know that the spotted owl is protected? Or would you be willing to pay $10 a year or something of the sort? Or you could give them trade-offs. You could say, which is more important to you? Protecting the logging industry or protecting spotted owl habitat. And And this is kind of what we do in our political system. I mean, it's messy because we're voting on lots of stuff all at once, but when a candidate runs on a environmental platform or a pro industry platform or something of the sort, they're giving us a choice. And then in voting, we communicate something about what our preference is. Yeah. Now there's other ways of doing this as well that are more they're a little more elaborate. You can actually run experiments, and a lot of economists, when we really need a price that's kind of accurate and it makes a big difference, we'll run experiments in which people are using real money, and they can choose where to put that money, either toward environmental things or other kinds of things, and or keep the money. And we can get a sense of what people are willing to pay for things, and then we aggregate that up. And those experiments can be really useful, but notice it's kind of artificial. The best we can do is create an artificial environment in which people are putting dollar values on things. And I think it's kind of fishy for a couple of reasons. One is that the dollar, I don't actually believe that if folks were willing to put a lot of money to protect the spotted owl, that means it's worth protecting. But if they weren't, that means it wasn't. Right? Like we are willing to pay lots of money to protect the bald eagle in particular. It has a lot of important symbolism. We'd probably be willing to pay a lot less money to protect, a local sparrow or something of the sort. But I mean, I think the sparrow is probably, in theological terms, similar in value to the bald eagle, and yet people will be willing to pay a lot less. So we can put a dollar value on these things, but when you see the dollar values people put on things, you are immediately confronted with the fact that people love dogs and cats more than they love any other animals, right? That they love horses, but they don't love cows, and it's really arbitrary, right? There aren't always good reasons for why we love the animals we love, and same thing for natural habitats and plants and other kinds of things.
Oh, okay.
And that same principle applies among environmentalists. They will choose to portray the spotted owl as opposed to a sea lamprey or something a lot less photogenic. It's also the case that what you're doing there is you're setting an agenda, right? And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean that, okay, let's say we get to save one animal. Okay, the bald eagle probably wins. If we get to save two animals, then okay, maybe some large, cute looking house cat-like animal, say the mountain lion. Well, eventually, people just aren't going to care about the 4,322nd animal to save, right? It's just human nature. So much of this boils down to in what order we consider these.
That's very true. And environmentalists do talk about there being charismatic and non-charismatic species, meaning some things are easy to get public support to protect and some things aren't. And an ugly fish that lives in the bottom of the Pacific that we don't eat, people aren't going to give money to that. So so I think this reveals a kind of a real deep underlying weakness in using human values, like the value that we individually place on a particular species, as a way of measuring whether or not we should protect it or how much protection it should get. I'm much more comfortable talking about valuing species preservation as a whole thing, rather than for specific animals, and then making a commitment on moral terms, not on a particular dollar terms, and then doing our best to then pursue that goal in the most efficient way we can, if that makes sense. I feel like we're on more solid ethical ground if we commit to the principle and then find the best way to achieve it, than to run an auction for a particular endangered species or something of the sort. And that's one of the ways in which I disagree with my guild. So economists are much more likely to say that the underlying value of something really is based on how much people value it. And I'm willing to say that the underlying value for things could be there even if people don't see it, right? And that's a theological commitment, fundamentally.
How would you value, hi, Tom Reddick, I represent growers and such, and how would you value something like the wolf, who comes back to Yellowstone, totally reshapes the species, clearly a keystone,
Yeah.
and isn't there some environmental value and benefit that we could quantify, saying, well, keystone species, when you lose them, the whole ecosystem goes to hell, so maybe we should protect those guys.
That's totally true, and some species just are really important for whole ecosystems, and wolves seem to be particularly important, and they're also obviously really controversial for a whole lot of reasons that we all know in the state of Michigan, in part because people are really worried about conflicts between wolves and people, and I suspect if we had a really substantial bear population, that we'd be running into similar debates about bears, but they're rare enough and whatnot that they haven't made a big deal. Black bears, at least. Grizzly bears would be more aggressive, maybe. But yes, we can ecologically look at species and kind of evaluate how important they are to particular ecosystems, and we can use that as a metric. And some environmentalists actually think we shouldn't be talking about individual species at all, but we should first be thinking about the health of whole ecosystems, and then asking, what do we need to do to preserve the ecosystem, as opposed to thinking about particular plants and animals. And in some cases, that makes a lot of sense.
I have I'm not quite prepared for this question, but I want to take advantage of your time. You know, when we talk ecosystems, I need to bring it down to the world that I live in, which is my neighborhood, and then maybe I can help something out in that level. And I live in a community where there's a lot of trees coming down, and the animals are scurrying to find new homes. And the animals provide a lot of health benefits, I think, to people that we don't quite recognize yet, just as trees do in the out of doors. So do you have any thoughts about, you know, people buy a lot, they chop all the trees down, they put in a lawn. So it doesn't provide habitat anymore, and the animals like die off or go somewhere else. And we think there's always somewhere else for the animals to go. And increasingly that is limited. Have you, you know, what I'm hoping is that someday somebody, and I'm sure it's happened, will do an urban animal study to say, you know, let's see how many urban animals there are, how they transport themselves around, what is a good environment for them, and how they support larger systems. Is there anything like that? And maybe this isn't a totally economic question. I feel it's a deeply spiritual one myself.
Well, I think it's a great question. And I do know of some work that has that kind of character to it. There actually has been a lot of work, just going a little bit off topic. There's been a lot of work investigating local watersheds, for instance, which is a very local ecosystem kind of thing. Y'all will note that, you know, we don't eat fish out of Lake Macatawa for good reasons, but, you know, 100 years ago we would have. And that's because of the way in which a city the size of Holland has a predictable impact on the health of the water that's running through it. Anytime we use land, human beings tend to disrupt the ecosystem there pretty dramatically, and land use is like the biggest. I mean, all right, I gotta be careful. For putting aside question of ocean life, which is really kind of dramatic, but land use is kind of the biggest issue for preservation of species and ecosystems. Human beings, there's a lot of us, and we use a lot of land, and the amount of land that can support really diverse ecosystems is just smaller and smaller. And I think it's really important that we think about ways in which we can invest in much more aggressively in land that isn't being used actively by human beings. I think we could do it if we change our agricultural system a bit. That's a longer topic. But the other alternative would be to try to build urban and suburban environments that support a wider variety of animals, which is what you're indicating. And I think there are ways to do that. There's just a very small number of animals that seem to be able to live in a real healthy way with humans, and obviously squirrels and possums and raccoons and sparrows and chickadees and whatnot. These are all on the list, but there's a lot of other animals and plant life that don't make the list so much. And of course, forest cover is valuable. And so I don't know the details, but my sense is that we would get a very in human communities, we get a very, very small list of thriving wildlife, right? And that's unfortunate. And we probably need to think about forest preserves kind of everywhere, if that makes sense. Just in order to create habitat space for wild animals.
Yeah, get the land before it gets sold. But again, that's a long process.
I mean, but we can reclaim land, right? I mean, you can buy land and it's a generational project. It's not something we can do, but it's doable. It's doable in a lifetime to grow a mature forest that can support a pretty diverse ecosystem of life. And then particularly if it also runs through a particular watershed, that can be really good for the water system as well.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and every time you said, well, that's a longer conversation, I hope you will create another HAS program and go into that further. There's a lot more to hear. Thank you.
There always is, but thank you for your good questions.
Okay, I have a couple more that came in quickly here. From Russell, with the war on plastics and gas emissions, are there new uses for petroleum in the works that aren't dangerous to the climate or environment?
That's a good question. I don't know a lot about that. I imagine some of my friends in chemistry and engineering would be able to tell you more. I don't know the process of creating plastics and asphalt and other kinds of and fuel enough to know like what kinds of uses of petroleum are good and which kinds aren't. I know that of course a lot of our fertilizers also come from petroleum, and I just don't know the chemistry. I don't know what's good and what's bad. I just know that when we burn it, that has problems.
Yeah. Okay, and then Lori, last one said that, wasn't there an app created to locate and identify the trees in Holland? And could that be broadened to include a habitat study to the question of the previous questioner?
There is such an app, and I'm in a group on campus that gets to have conversations about some of this stuff. And I know that they're working actually on the database of trees that they've built. They did a tree census, sorry, and connecting all of that with the app. And I think they're trying to update it and expand it a little bit. I can talk to them about making it more expansive. I mean, it's a matter of finding the folks with the ability to work with the computers and do their magic so that it does the neat stuff. But some of that's beyond me. I don't know how big a project it would be, but I do think the idea of making it easy for folks to understand their kind of immediate environment is just really cool. Much like I love learning about Holland history, I love hearing about about local environmental kind of stuff and getting a sense of what's going on very locally, so that when I'm just walking and living, we can live more responsibly, but also we can kind of just appreciate what we have more.
Excellent point. Thank you. It is about 11 o'clock. Bruce, would you like to wrap us up?
Sure. Just wanted to say thank you to Stephen for your time with us. It's always engaging to think about such disparate things in a unified way. And while there may be some ethical issues on how do we put price on priceless things, nonetheless, we understand that's how the world works. And our job is to be effective stewards, not so idealistic that nothing gets done. So we appreciate the perspective of an economist, and we especially appreciate you. So thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank
Pleasure.
you so much. Let's give him a hand. Virtual applause. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great day.
To Laura.
Will do.